Hey everybody, welcome to Public Access America's Just the Tip.
Ooh, just the tip. When playing Metro Exodus, definitely make sure that you stock up on as much materials as possible to make ammo and clean your weapons. Because let's be real honest, Metro is a really fun game, and most people don't tend to think about figuring out how you're going to be able to sustain combat. And it's kind of funny because as I've been playing Metro Exodus and looking at how things have gone in Ukraine, I'm like, man, this there's something about this that feels a little too close to what's happened. Oh. And so resource management is really important in the game, and making sure that you have the resources that you need to sustain the fight is really important in Metro Exodus, but just in general.
It is time now for something positive.
We might be headed to the promised land,
speaking the truth and finding our external liberty once we internally liberate ourselves.
Problem can only be solved when there is a kind of coalition of conscience.
Because that is how it works.
This is the beginning, it is not the finale, and that's why we're here, and that's why we rally.
We've got to be that creative minority.
Find a way to get in the way. I got in trouble. It was good trouble. It was necessary trouble.
Frankly, I know we've got to do something.
Nope, I'm glad I've never had it.
Nope.
Hey, we're back at Public Access America. Don't forget, you can find our podcast anywhere you find our favorite podcast, and you can find a live stream just like this one on YouTube for now, 11 a.m. Noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Central, 7 p.m. Europe. Let's give a shout out to Earkick. Hey, we had somebody reach out. I Was Born This Gay, a new podcast, reached out on Red Circle. This guy, he is an expert in LGBT history in Russia and America.
Ooh,
and
wow.
Yeah.
In Russia even. That's really cool.
His first episode is the hero of the fall of Russia, and he was a gay guy. And I'm excited to actually listen. I put it on because they sent us a request. Hey, where are you, Dan? We're just pausing, waiting for you.
He's muted.
What's up, folks? I'm just letting you guys riff. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got you.
Yay!
That's a new logo since the last time I've been on.
Yes, sir.
Can one of you guys move your head so I can see the whole thing? That's cool. I like that.
We wanted to get the politics out of it. People are tired of politics. So, and we're on episode 750. So it's about, we want to be the podcast that advocates, not the podcast that discusses things that sound political,
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. Love the logo. Yeah. Nice and simple and effective. I'm a big fan of that.
And we were, in our last episode, we were talking about education and communication and, getting experience, education through experience, getting it through academia, and how we all need to work together. And we actually called you out because you wanted to be the communication in there. And that was the missing link between all of it, because we decided that academia needs to work with people to create better,
Oh, I will rant about that for 4 hours if you want me to. But I completely agree. I think the integration of academia into society is long overdue. There's a reason behind the ivory tower, and I'm happy to chat about that. But just in general, I really like the idea of rebranding to be more education advocacy, bringing people together focus. I think that's a really good idea.
Me too. I want more informed voices and experts offering their perspectives so that we can come up with diverse solutions. And I'm just going to kind of leave you two to talk about it, because last time you two were together, it was one of the greatest conversations I've gotten to listen to, So I just have fun. I messaged Dan and I was like, what should we talk about? And he's like, I'll be there. And I messaged Jeffrey and he was like, oh, hell yeah, Dan's going to be there. And I was like, I don't know what you're going to talk about. And he's like, I don't care. So I can't, I can't even imagine to guess at what you two would want to talk about. But what's important to you, Dan? What's top of your mind this week?
Top of my mind this week. That's
Yeah.
really interesting. There's been a lot going on. I think it's been interesting because for the first time in probably over 2 years, the top news cycle has not been COVID. That doesn't mean that COVID's gone away by any stretch, but it's definitely gotten more manageable, and we definitely have a better handle on it. And my good friends who work in hospital infection control and government epidemiology, right there's a lot more confidence going around right now. But just seeing how the news cycle has shifted away from domestic health to foreign policy has been kind of an interesting shift. And I don't want to say back to normal because there's nothing normal about what's happening in Eastern Europe right now, and all the machinations in Ukraine with Russia and how NATO is responding and all of that. But it's just weird because I've been so used to waking up in the morning and just the first thing and the only thing people talk about is just COVID, COVID, COVID. And it's interesting to have that shift in perspective and how that reflects kind of our shift in priorities and concerns as a country. But I really, honestly, like you said, what do we want to talk about? I was like, I'll just be there and show up. So I'm happy to just riff on anything. But that's kind of where I've been reflecting. It's like, wait a second, there's things besides COVID. Even though COVID's still there, how do we now this post-pandemic shift that we're having? How we're gonna kind of rebalance our priorities moving forward?
But do either one of you feel a PTSD about the COVID times? When I thought about having you on, I remembered you starting as a contact tracer in Pennsylvania. I think about everywhere Dan has been in this pandemic, and I think I tried watching a South Park episode and it was about masks. I turned it off. I had this weird buzzing in my brain that said I don't want to relive that.
Yeah, I don't want to say PTSD, but there's definitely behavioral and emotional spurs that I get from the whole process. So, for example, like you mentioned, I started out in contact tracing, but then I moved up into just full-on outbreak investigations at the peak of the pandemic in December 2020, with pre-Delta. In the first winter that we had with COVID, I was working as a local government epidemiologist where I was the on-call guy for 14 different nursing homes dealing with outbreaks. I worked overtime on Christmas Day because that's how slammed everyone was. It was really, really bad, right?
Yeah.
And working a lot of time and just kind of coming back out of that. I've stepped away from that and gone and done other things as well. But I think just having the time to reflect on that, it's like there's been a lot of changes in my perspective, and I think one thing that I'm very grateful for is that I've become a little more healthily skeptical and critical of certain things in public health. I'm not in any sense like I'm definitely supportive of vaccination and good infection control and masking. Like there's all kinds of evidence for that. But I think what's been really good is going through a really serious coming out of education and applied research and getting into the meat and potatoes of actual like public health emergency response. It's been interesting to see and reflect on how we can do better. Not just, everyone talks about the government and Trump or Biden or like the top levels, but how can we as a systems try and debrief what we can do? And now we finally have the breathing room to do that. Because even though COVID has not gone away, and like I said in previous episodes, it's never going to go away. It's always going to be endemic. It's always going to be a public health concern we have to deal with. But we now have the space and the management techniques and the kind of low prevalence that we can start thinking about how we can retool for the next one, because there will be a next one, like I've said before. So I think, like, to summarize that rant, it's like I went through the experience. I saw a lot of stuff. I have a lot of names of dead people tattooed into my brain from it, because that's what my job was in many ways, was helping all the situation. And now having the chance to reflect, I had a chance to reflect while COVID was still the main news cycle, while I wasn't working directly in public health. But now I have the chance to reflect even more now that it's not even the primary news cycle anymore. And it's just like another stage of separation and kind of feeling out who I've become after that ordeal. But that's kind of where I'm at. What do you guys think?
Well, that actually kind of moves into where I'm at, because, like you said, it's not even the main news cycle, and from a data perspective, one of the headlines that I've kind of seen pop up is, the media keeps popping up with, the BA2 subvariant of Omicron, and how, oh my God, it's become the predominant strain in the US. But as a data person, I'm looking at the data that exists, and even though it's become the predominant strain, during that time, cases just keep going down. And so it's like one of those things where it's like, mathematically speaking, like, and scientifically speaking, yeah, BA2 probably competes better versus BA 1.1 and then the original Omicron strain. But at the same time, those strains spread so fast that there might not necessarily be a lot of places left for BA2 to compete.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's important to consider, and I think we've talked about this in different chunks and different previous episodes that I've been on, but thinking about the evolution of infectious diseases is always based on the ecological niche that they can fill. And after every round of infection, there's a different series of niches that can be filled that depend on host immunity, the environmental conditions, and the actual agent itself, right? We always think about that as like the epidemiologic triad: host, agent, and environment. Those are the three major factors that affect the spread or the severity of disease. And every kind of cycle that we have with COVID, there are new circumstances that the virus has to navigate, and so that drives evolution. It's not a conscious process, but yeah, right now that ecological niche with the environment, temperatures getting warmer, more people are spending time outside, that's happening. Our immunity is catching up, not just because vaccinations continue to grow, but more naturalized immunity, which is kind of probably shorter term and not as effective, but it's better than nothing. And people are getting boosted, and now with the FDA authorizing a second booster shot for people age 50 and older, right, there's all kinds of these different environmental changes, and the best that we can hope for is that it continues to kind of force the virus into a niche that is not really major. That doesn't mean that the virus itself is not deadly, but as long as we can continue on this path, it'll continue going down. Now, we're going to continue having cycles. I'm sure there's going to be spikes after major events. We're going to have an up in cases like after Memorial Day and 4th of July, and it's definitely in the winter, just like we've been noticing for the past couple of years. But now we can start having the realistic conversation of at a public health level, how much do we need to dedicate to it? And then having those difficult discussions of saying, well, Omicron BA.2 can still cause severe disease, and there are people still being hospitalized, and people are immunocompromised, right? We need to be protective and supportive of those people, but what is the balance? And it's kind of what's that quote from? Is it the Imitation Game, the one about Alan Turing and the Enigma machine, starring Benedict Cumberbatch? Is like the blood-soaked calculus. Like that's kind of this. That's a lot of like public health responses. Like what do we need to invest in order to cover the most number of people, knowing that we're not going to catch everybody, and how do we kind of reckon with ourselves that we're not going to catch everybody or protect absolutely everyone because we just physically can't. What do we do for mitigation?
Right. And so, and that's the other question is that right now, especially in this moment, we have more tools available to us than we ever have before. You've got the shots that exist currently. You've got Omicron specific boosters that are being developed, and it sounds like they're going to be potentially deployed. I know that they initially worked on Delta ones, but it was kind of one of those things where they figured out that there wasn't enough change that having a Delta specific booster was worthwhile. But Omicron, perhaps. You've got the Paxlovid protease inhibitor. You've got monoclonal antibodies prior and now specific to Omicron. We have more tools in the toolbox now than we ever had before. And so, like, for example, I was doing some math. I was doing some calculations looking at here's what the risk of hospitalization and death looks like after 3 shots. Here's what it looks like if you have the shots, but then you end up, needing Paxlovid. Here's what that risk then multiplies down to. And if you're still not doing well, like we have monoclonal antibodies. And if, you end up getting that, mathematically speaking, it's like a 0.0018% chance that you end up
dead, is the way that I did the math based off of the available data. And so, realistically speaking, you have something that's gone to, quite literally what, a lot of people said is potentially less deadly than the flu. But that said, what do you think makes sense in terms of like how we look at, treating with the tools that we have now?
I first want to say that this is the end. This is kind of the end state that a lot of people were kind of focusing on for a while, like where we're at right now. It's like, how do we get the whole flatten the curve, that all that stuff, which I still say that should have been the slogan that should have been painted on every building and on every PSA, flatten the curve for years, right? Right. Well, this is finally at the point where the curve is being flattened, right? And we're like, oh crap, now what do we do? It's like, because we've been all the mitigation measures and all the emergency response and health protocols that we've had have been because we did not have this barrage or this armory of tools to come to prevent and control and treat these diseases, right? So I think it's just important for us to reflect on that. But in terms of what we can do, I think and this goes back again, I keep saying what I said before, right? The cultural changes that happened during COVID, there are definitely things that we should continue supporting in terms of a public health standpoint. First of all, staying home if you're sick. I mean, that should never ever come back. Like, why we accepted that as a society is just, thinking of it now, absolutely beyond me, right? Having hand sanitizer and hand hygiene stations and all these places that we, in public we can do, right? But in terms of how we're treating, we now have pretty robust understandings of which treatments are effective, which, and for what purposes and for what, what levels. And so now we're at a point where federal agencies and state public health authorities that have been giving this emergency guidance can now shift their focus into saying, here are some clinical recommendations for, these combinations of certain things, right? So now we're actually shifting away from trying to do our best guess based on what we had in the past for other diseases, and now knowing enough about COVID that, like you said, we have all these tools, but we also know how to use them. So having the agencies that are involved in public health, emergency response and preparedness, like all the same ones that are just involved in general public health, reshifting their focus to clinical considerations, indications, contraindications, right? Going back to what they were doing, I don't want to say antebellum, but anti-pandemicum or whatever, right? So we're kind of reaching back to normal. It's like now we have a good grip on it. So I in terms of how should we do it, we should trust the authorities that have done their best to navigate through this really nasty crisis. And now we have data from a large number of really good medical scientists who have been publishing this. So that's kind of my general comment, rather than saying, I don't want to, because I'm not a good clinical pharmacist, I'm not a board certified physician, I'm not going to comment on specific combinations, but we do have this body that we can rely on now that we've been hoping to have for more than 2 years. And now we finally have it to proceed with.
Thank you to everybody in the daisy chain that got us to where we are. That shouldn't pass by without a big thank you to you and everyone like you that got us here.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a slog for a lot of people.
It's not said enough. It's not said enough because the science is messy and learning is messy. But we know more by doing that than we did by ignoring tests. You remember when it was herd immunity and stop testing people? We wouldn't have known anything. We'd still be in the dark ages. So it's people like Jeffrey, people like Dan, their associates, the people they work with, the people they fought for, that actually made the difference that got us to an endemic stage.
And to reflect back on Jason, of course, like the people who were willing to continue having the platforms for us to talk about these things and to continue to encourage the process, while we were all wrestling with all this as a scientific entity or scientific bodies, right? Having the ability for us to kind of share and continue to have the patience of the public and the media and the providers of the platforms that we needed in order to not just find things out, but disseminate that. Like I said, communication, right? That's the most important part. What's the point of having all the knowledge if you don't share it? We need people like you, Jason, and a lot of other folks involved who are going to continue caring about public health, even though it's easy to say, oh, COVID's over. It's like, no, it's not over, but there's always going to continue to be public health needs. And hopefully that's going to be another change in our society, that we continue to give public health issues the credence that they deserve, rather than just having them be kind of like a
Agreed.
flashy, like a new study proves that wine doesn't cause cancer, right? No, let's increase the quality of our science communication permanently, just as we are increasing our, availability of hand sanitizer and the concept of people staying home, and the people, like, I am sick is a completely reasonable thing for someone to not come to do something, right?
That's right.
It has to be paired together, and those are, the preventative measures that are going to take us a long way, rather than just relying on, oh, they'll find a new drug eventually.
So I got two questions for you, Dan. The first one is one that you might not necessarily be able to give an answer to, but it seems like we've now shifted towards endemic care of the virus. A lot of places are kind of doing that across Europe, and that's what it feels like is that we understand that we're going to live with the virus. We have a bunch of tools. Some countries have said, yes, we're switching to endemic care. We haven't exactly come out and said that yet either. But it really does feel like that's where we're headed with the relaxing of masking, mandates, the acknowledgement that we have all of these tools.
And ending Title 42, by the way, as well.
Ending Title 42, the whole test to receive Paxlovid at a local pharmacy, all of these kind of things that are, just kind of seem like we're moving away from this idea of this being a pandemic into treating it endemic, like the flu virus, like influenza.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That is honestly where we're at, and some people are not going to be willing to come out and say that, because for a number of reasons. One, I think a lot of the feedback, some folks who are kind of excessively critical of the process will be like, see, it's all resolved, it's all fine. You just made a whole thing, you want to make this permanent, right? Come up with all this unfair criticism of saying, well, you guys all did all this stuff and for the last 2 years and it was all bullshit, right? No, it wasn't. I think if someone comes up and says, hey, we're now in an endemic stage, I think a lot of people who will say negative things about the last 2 years, and public opinion will drop, being like, well, really, we just got here anyways, not understanding kind of how the epidemiology works. But you're definitely right. We are at that stage. And I think what happens now, just kind of comparing that to how we manage infectious diseases of other types that are either endemic or kind of sporadic, where they pop up every once in a while in certain places. A lot of the care, would that I should be focusing on targeting high-risk individuals, making sure that they have access to the supplies and the preventive care that they need. Vaccine distribution in this country is still very uneven, so they'll working on those. And these are the same things that we work on for influenza vaccination rates, or disease surveillance in communities where surveillance is a challenge for all kinds of reasons. Right? It's going to shift. It already has shifted, mainly with COVID, more towards treating COVID as, I don't want to say another disease, but another disease, right? We have systems in place where we do this. I think just what I'm hopeful for is that the publicity of the last couple of years will continue a push saying, hey, these are things that we need to fund, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, just for whatever it is, whether it's a coronavirus, if it's influenza, if it's tuberculosis, whatever it is, right? So it really is, that is where we're at. I'm just hoping that we're at, pre-pandemic 2.0, where we know what's going on, and we have greater attention and greater care and just greater societal acceptance and endorsement of infection control practices that will be a little bit more safe. And next time we have a pandemic, not having a chronic shortage of toilet paper and bleach and hand sanitizer, because now
hot pockets.
Because now we know how people are going to respond when there's a once in a lifetime pandemic, which will be in the next 10, 15, 20 years. You mark my words, right? How do we prepare the supply chains to manage that? How do we make sure that policies that, what are some of the policies that we realize were very intimately linked with the pandemic response? How do we make sure that there's proper internet access to people who need to work remotely if they need to work from home, right? All these things that we found out along the way, now we're at a point of recovery. And it just goes through like, there was a preparedness stage, then there was an impact stage where COVID hit. Now we've been in like response mode, and now we're kind of shifting to like the final mode of like emergency management, which is like recovery
and analyzing it. That's what I love about it. We know so much about pandemics now and people's responses to them.
For sure. The after action review is what is happening now and what we need to work on.
I just wish there was more books about that than there was about Donald Trump's presidency. You know what I mean?
You got to see what will sell, though, right? That's unfortunate. But
that is unfortunate. You know, I wish we could teach people to read beyond the headline. I'm sorry, Jeffrey. Go ahead.
Oh, it's all right. No, so here's question number 2. So now I'm going to dig into public health brain, Dan.
Yay.
So, over the course of the pandemic, one of the things that we learned from a technological standpoint was that the ability to work from home, once thought of as a pipe dream, became a reality. But like you said, this idea of stay home if you're sick, one of the things that we have, the biggest issue of is, number one, access to sick leave, I would say, for a lot of people. But also, number two, I think you have a lot of companies that are seeing this idea of, return to office, and that you're never going to have the need to work from home again. There's a lot of companies out there that have said, no, we're just going to go totally remote. We don't have to deal with all the overhead. But from a public health standpoint, do you think that there would be viable guidance in how, let's say, you might not necessarily, you kind of solve two problems. Number one, you might not necessarily have companies increasing sick leave, but have a policy that increases their ability to allow people to work from home if they're sick. Because let's face it, I'm the kind of person who has always worked sick. It's just what I do. I'm miserable anyways. I might as well be miserable and not have to deal with an entire day of catching up on emails.
Yeah. Well, I think and this is where you start getting into public health law and policy and what is the lane of different agencies getting involved, right? The CDC is not just this catch-all for everything that related to health and disease, right? There's certain things that they are and are not allowed to do, just like certain state health departments, just like, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, right? Yeah. So now in terms of, are you going to make a recommendation when people continue to work from home, right? I think it's completely fair for some entity to come out and say, look, there is evidence showing that work from home and allowing work restrictions for people who are ill is an effective way to control disease in workplaces, right? We have plenty of data on that, right?
And that's an important thing to do. That's something we should focus on.
Yeah, and there's definitely recommendations that can be made at state and federal levels to support that. But how does that get translated into policy? And is it the role of the federal government and is it the role of public health agencies to try and institute policy saying you have to allow for work from home? Whose authority is that? And that answer gets messy, right? We talked in a previous episode about how the Supreme Court shot down the federal vaccine mandate because the mandate was structured to be, OSHA making it, but then the argument that won was ultimately, well, COVID is not exclusively a workplace hazard exposure thing, so you can't just have OSHA regulate something that's like outside of the workspace, right? OSHA has a lane. One can debate what the width of that lane is, right? Just like the CDC has a lane, just like the FDA has a lane. So in terms of adding those recommendations, I think it's completely reasonable for those recommendations to come into play because they exist. But now it comes into this interesting question of like with American society, we do have a little bit more laissez-faire, regulatory agencies as compared to say a lot of Western European or Central European countries. Look at what's happening with the workforce now, right? The workforce is making a lot of these demands. And people calling it the Great Resignation as a Great Recession, right? Now you're starting to, I'm walking around, I'm seeing Chipotle offering $15 an hour minimum with 401ks, right? How much does the workforce have to play in forcing prospective employers that are hurting for personnel to say, yeah, let's do it hybrid? And also, was it JP Morgan that was like, or was it Chase or some bigger banking entity said, 100% of people have to come back into the office, and then like only
Goldman Sachs,
right? And then half of them just didn't. Right, you can't you can't fire half your workforce, right? So I think and this is kind of linking back to our discussion about the policies and the procedures that we didn't really perceive to be part of the pandemic at the first stage when we started doing lockdowns, right? Supply chain management, personnel management, work from home management, IT management, right? One of those other things is, the workforce is going to define whether at the end of the day, the workforce is going to define how much you are going to do, right? And if the American workers are like, yeah, no, screw this, I'm not going to come into work because I have 2 kids who are immunocompromised, and what's the point of me sitting in an office next to Jerry who coughs and sneezes all the time and his bouts of COPD induced, I don't know, asthma, spreading my diseases, right?
Jerry.
Why am I going to do that and then bring that down to whoever, right? There's going to be a lot of millions of individual decisions are lining up together in really unprecedented ways, and I think it's sociologically fascinating. But
me too.
It also plays into, is it the government's job to say certain things and mandate certain things? If so which government agency is responsible? And if not, what can the workers do to ensure that they have optimal conditions that actually benefit their public health and their preferences?
So this is where this gets interesting, because, like, for example, because I work in risk, one of the things that, risk brain me goes, so if you have to be concerned about employee productivity all the time. We think about things like, if our IT goes down, if we have a DDoS attack, if we have some type of major event like an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane or whatever that compromises our ability to do work. And in a lot of cases, most people don't really think about it, but the cost of productivity during pre-pandemic cold and flu cycles was always really heavy. Why? Because you had a bunch of people sardined into rooms. They would ultimately end up getting each other sick, and you would just have this rotation throughout your building for a while where you would probably be down anywhere from 10 to 25% of your staff because they're all out sick with the flu. So what we have learned through COVID is that having work from home protocols, especially as you have someone who is in your building or in your immediate area that gets sick and you get sent home, it helps you, like, as we all know, it helped contain the spread. So the question then becomes, if you were to issue guidance, obviously it's not something where I think that, public health is going to be able to sit down and make the law of you have to offer work from home. But as a way of businesses being able to mitigate risk, showing the data of how having a work from home option as cold and flu season hits, not only, number one, reduces the chance that you're going to have multiple staff members out because of illness, but number two, the fact that you're going to be able to keep productivity. There's going to be, I think, there's definitely an avenue for public health to be able to say, look, we can't make a rule, but based off of a lot of observed evidence, here is a guidance that we would suggest that every business look at and review with all seriousness. As number one, it's going to help you in terms of the cost of being able to keep people in the office and productive, just because you won't have them out sick. But also, number two, it allows them to have that ability and flexibility to plan in a risk-based environment, saying, look, here's what local health guidance is for any number of issues, and this is how we can fit this into our own business plan. It's not something that the government is enforcing upon us, but because of the data that's available, it's a solid recommendation that can be made that businesses can plan for and decide on their own whether or not that's something they want to implement.
For sure. And that's kind of, you're really nicely setting up the differences between different federal agencies when it comes to these things. So OSHA would definitely be able to, if they wanted to, try to implement certain regulations. And they definitely have updated a ton of regulations regarding like work restrictions related to COVID, but then now kind of shifting more towards the preventative, preparedness side. How does this, are you going to allow for, delay, how quickly do you need to update your air ventilation systems or HVAC systems? Because now we know that proper filtration of air and ventilation is effective to control COVID. And we've known for decades that it's, not just COVID, but there's all kinds of standards in like operating rooms and healthcare fields for like how you filter your air, right? That's just one of a million different examples versus guidance from the CDC that is just general guidance. And then it gets really hairy and interesting because now not only do you have regulations that you have to abide by, but then you have, in the world of guidance versus regulation, you have the wonderful beast of the class action lawsuit, wherein dozens of workers at a particular location if they have the ability to do so, who say, okay, they are they're falling behind on guidance, right? This guidance is not being adhered to, but it's still guidance. They're just being flagrantly unsupportive of us in our public health desires and demands as a workforce. We're going to sue, or we're going to mass resign, or we're going to do X, Y, and Z, not because you're violating a law inherently, but because there's so much evidence that you should be doing this. There's no official law, so you say, screw it. Where is that boundary? Are you going to have the government come in and enforce regulations on the business, or is the business going to shut down because half the workforce leaves because they don't like their employees? And I think one thing that this also ties into, we're talking about cultural changes and workforce changes. It really is going to be, I would hope, as a public health specialist and an infectious disease epidemiologist, that the number one changes that we would have in our society would be based on purely on disease control. But I genuinely think, my logic American brain, right, as a citizen and as a worker and as an employee, I think the number one change that we're going to see culturally after COVID is the en masse by the millions workers saying, why do I have to stand for this shit? Right? That's kind of the number one thing that I think is going to, in American culture, I think the cultural change is going to be focused on that. And it kind of reflects the road to progress and innovation in this country and across most of the world is marred by milestones of mass death and chaos, right? We like, I remember learning in high school about what we call the long 19th century, right? The 19th century, like, of American and British and European imperialism that didn't end in 1900, but it ended after the First World War and into the Second World War, because there was this massive cultural change from the First World War. The women's workforce movement that amplified during the Second World War, because millions of American men were not able to run the factories and everything, and then they came back to households where the women were like, we've been running our shit for just fine without you, so what do we do, right? So these cultural changes that keep happening, that are instilled by massive crises involving lots of woe and death and suffering, have been marking our changes in our culture. And I think COVID is already doing exactly that. So now, what are we going to see in the next 10 to 15 years as the generation that kind of came of age in the workforce during COVID is progressing? Just as we have seen the cultural changes even in the last 20 years of, like, well, the Great Recession, that the elder millennials that came of age at that point and started getting blamed for everything under the sun as they were trying to progress into jobs under the Great Recession. Like, you go back every major step. I think that's going to be the major change to watch, more so than the public health recommendations, which at the end of the day are going to be like, here are things that we already know on a general scale. Here's some more detailed information. Here's a couple more vaccines and therapeutics that we can add to our arsenal, and then kind of evolve to hopefully be more high profile, as opposed to this massive shift in culture that we're thinking about. And I'm just really, I don't want to say excited. I'm just very curious, and like, this is going to be very interesting to watch from a scholarly perspective. I'm sorry, please go ahead, Jason.
We're seeing that labor empowerment at Disney right now, where employees are protesting the "Don't Say Gay" in Florida. We're seeing unionization in Amazon plants. So we're seeing what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think
even I quit my job a couple weeks ago because I was tired of the way that I was being treated, right?
And I think what's interesting is what Jeffrey was talking about. If we did a study on viruses affecting the workforce and compared that to viruses affecting the infrastructure, cyber, I think we could learn that we're losing just as much money on the productivity of people getting sick as we are our computer systems getting viruses.
Yeah. And I think now this is going to be, and I think the point I was leading into was that, talk about the long 19th century. I wonder if we can start thinking about how this is a kind of a cultural shift that's reminiscent of, I don't know, a long 20th century, right? We have the amazing technology of the internet and all this instant communication, access to instant information that we have. But now, the office was the office still. Just instead of having files and typewriters and Rolodexes, we had a bunch of computers on a bunch of desks. Now the workspace is going to look very different because of these demands being enforced upon by the American workforce. And folks like Jeffrey who are in risk, you're now going to think, okay, we need to really up our cyber because we don't just have one intranet that we can control. We now have a lot of VPNs, a lot of people remoting in. We're going to have to face these challenges because it's just not going to go away. And the idea of do we need to work 5 days a week? Like I tell you, the job that I left, right? I didn't like the way I was being treated, but I was not working 40 hours a week. I was doing what they asked me to do, and I was done. And like, if you actually compiled all of it, I could have done it in 2.5 days, and I was just as efficient, more efficient, if anything, than if they brought me into an office. So now that begs the question: do you need me to run your business if you're going to work me realistically 2.5 days? Or do you need everyone to be working 4 days instead of 5 days? Or are you going to have the size of your workforce, and then what are you going to do with the people who are not going to be working because they're not needed for companies that are now all of a sudden much more automated and efficient because they don't have to have a bunch of centralized infrastructure, right? All these questions are going to really come down hard in the next 10, 15 years. And because of the changes that we saw in ourselves and the possibilities that emerged or that we realized were possible because of the forces of the pandemic. And that's how infectious diseases have been since the dawn of time. Pandemics have shifted massively shifted cultures. You look to the Black Death in the 1300s and 1400s in the UK, right? You look at the pandemic influenza in the 1900s, right? Infectious diseases have always shifted and shaped the course of cultural human history, and we're just living through that latest iteration right now. And it's something that we need to embrace. We don't have to be happy about it per se, but we have to acknowledge that it exists, because if we keep denying it, we're going to just keep losing ground. So I completely agree with what you guys are saying. There's all kinds of these new challenges, and we can't shy away from them because it's not going to stop. It's going to keep going, and there's going to be another, major shift, probably related to some kind of infectious disease pandemic within our lifetimes.
Agreed.
Yeah. So now let's talk about something even more fun.
Here we go.
Because we can't. We really can't ignore what's happening in Eastern Europe. And it's been kind of an interesting one. But let's talk about public health and war in Ukraine. I think there's probably something to be said about the way, that health, the way that you look at health and the way that you look at an active war zone that we don't really talk about. We're
been on
used
my
to the
head,
idea
actually. I've wondered about that. COVID in Ukraine. Why aren't we talking about that anymore?
Well, not even just COVID in Ukraine. I would say, like, what are we looking at as a whole? Because you do have this mass influx of people into Poland and other EU nations, but also too, you start to see other health issues arise when you have, constant bombardment, lack of food, lack of medical supplies being able to get in. I mean, any number of things. So what are you seeing, Dan?
Well, to start off with a bit of dark humor, I saw a really just brutally funny TikTok the other day where somebody went on to, how Google, you can just do like coronavirus insert place here and you can see the trends because they start drafting it. You do coronavirus Ukraine, right? And all of a sudden it just goes to 0 after the invasion. It's like they saw coronavirus by getting invaded, right? It's like absolutely brutal. But no, it raises a really interesting point, is that priorities can really shift when you have major cataclysmic events going on. And for Ukraine, they're literally fighting for the sovereignty of their country. They're probably diverting all the resources they have available away from public health and disease prevention, away from those entities, more towards keeping alive and keeping functioning. And I think it's interesting to see that interplay too. But it is interesting as well because public health and sanitation and hygiene don't go away when you get invaded, and if anything, they get doubly or triply important, right? Go back to the Civil War. 2/3 of the casualties in the Civil War are from diseases and non-battle injuries, or what we call in the military DNBIs, right?
Revolutionary War too, same thing.
Yeah. It's the Revolutionary War, right? 70% to 80% were, not from combat, right? If you actually look at the numbers of people who died in the battles in the Revolutionary War, they were in the hundreds, and most of them. It's like obviously tragic, right? But you compare that to the thousands or tens of thousands that you've seen in other wars, right? It's because you lose half your army on the march through the swamps. But that's exactly what Ukraine is facing right now. They're now facing issues of like, how do you keep the lights on in the hospital while the entire city is getting bombed? That's another part of like, that's something that infectious disease epidemiology and infection control and prevention and preparedness is intimately involved in. It's just that their priorities have shifted away from, surveillance at a national level and national level distribution of certain things to literally having just the basic functions of society still be there, right? What happens when you've completely destroyed a town and there are 30,000 people in there and there's no functioning sewers, right? It's the same stuff that happened,
Right.
with Hurricane Katrina, right? Or any of the major hurricanes that hit the American Southeast. Like there's days to weeks and sometimes with
Dysentery,
Katrina,
right?
even months where, you have these really nasty diarrheal diseases, waterborne illnesses, foodborne illnesses. You can't get safe food in there, right? That's where your priorities of public health shift when you have major cataclysmic level crises in your area. And unfortunately, Ukraine has been facing that on literally every front that they have. And we don't even know what the numbers of people who've died or been killed either by just direct combat or civilians killed in firefights or war crimes or God knows what's going on. But what's clear is that Ukraine's infrastructure is absolutely decimated, and with that comes the post impact levels of public health concern, or the impacts of public health concern, which is often foodborne, waterborne diseases. If you have a lot of people in shelters, respiratory illnesses that thrive in there, right? So you need public health to maintain itself, but you're going to lose out on like the federal surveillance infrastructure, which requires a lot of time, money, infrastructure, dedication, manpower in order to run that Ukraine just doesn't have the privilege of running right now. So that's kind of my general perspective on that. So.
And Russia's dealing with the same stuff, I'm imagining. You know what I mean? They just left Chernobyl, and we found that they had dug trenches there so that they could lay in radiated dirt. Like what's going to come out of that?
That's what happens. Well, it's not so much like the dirt around there is not. They're not reopening the core, but it also kind of highlights the fact that in terms of their military strategy, they weren't particularly effective at communicating risk, right?
Right.
And when in the military, whenever there's, or at least in the army, right, whenever there's a unit that deploys overseas, one of the fundamental things they have to do is first of all make sure everyone's up on their vaccinations and make sure that they have all their details up. They do pre-deployment screenings and like dental work and physicals. There's all kinds of pre-screenings to make sure that you're not putting people into a remote combat environment where they're going to be out of the fight because of something not related to combat. But also, you have to do health threats briefings. You have to make sure that your soldiers or sailors or airmen or marines or guardians, whoever's going where, you have to make sure that they are aware of the health threats that they're going to face that are not bullets coming from downrange. Right. And that's something that clearly either those groups of soldiers did not pay attention to, or Russia did not heed carefully enough, thinking, oh, whatever, it's a loss. But like we said before, historically the grand majority of casualties in war among fighting armies and navies has been the diseases and the non-battle injuries as opposed to direct action. So if you just ignore all of that, you're only going to weaken your fighting force, and as a result be less effective at winning wars. And I wonder how much, because we don't have a lot of that information, right? How much of the Russian convoy that stopped, how much of that was due to people just weren't prepared? How much of it was due to cold weather injury? How much of it was to crappy rations that people got sick on, right? What percentage of the people have they had to pull back on, and how much of that has affected their military strategy?
Right.
Because they did not do a sufficient job of preparing for the diseases and non-battle injuries that plague the fighting force, right? And not to disclose too much information about myself, but this is literally what I do for a living, right? Controlling and preventing diseases and non-battle injuries is like I'm exceptionally qualified to talk about that without declaring too much.
I was just thinking about Vietnam and World War II, how venereal diseases almost brought down the army. So it's interesting to think we don't know what disease is affecting this war, and to find that out later, that would be really interesting on the longer timeline.
My favorite little factoid that's kind of more relevant. I know World War II is over almost like 80 years ago, right? But in the Sicily campaign, where the United States and the UK invaded Sicily on its way up to capture Italy, there were more hospitalizations among American soldiers for influenza than there were for combat.
Interesting.
Now, what happens if you have effective respiratory disease control, where all of a sudden you more than double your hospital capacity? Now, in terms of as a military commander, you start having very interesting discussions that can open on a table of what is our actual acceptable casualty rate. How much forward support infrastructure are we going to need in order to support those casualties? Or how much can we reduce? How much support and sustainment can we reduce if we have effective disease control measures? It's a really fascinating concept of war that people don't really appreciate, because it's much more interesting to talk about the guns and the bullets and the fighting and the heroism and everything. And I get that, but the sustainment wins wars, right?
Yeah. Public Access America.
It's always funny because, like, especially because as libertarians, we get a ton of shit, even amongst other libertarians.
I think political philosophy is a lot like religion, and where there's moments you have to go on faith and trust what somebody else is saying.
The main focus is just like less dependence on the government, because, well, we've seen how that's gone.
And you don't have to do that if you think about it in a human way.
More dependence on connections with each other.
You can always bring it back to what would one human do for another? What would 100 do for 100?
People looking out for people.
Find Public Access America anywhere you find your favorite podcast every Sunday and Thursday. And join the chat on YouTube at Public Access America every Sunday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific.
Communities looking out for community.
Public Access America. History in the making, making history in the making, in the making, in the making, in the making, in the making.
And I mean, that's one of the things, I've always heard is that, an army fights on their stomach. And, when you think about it, at least from a health perspective, if you're not being fed well, it makes it really difficult to fight off a lot of those infections you might get, when your rations are bad, and you literally just aren't getting the caloric intake that you need in order to keep just your normal standards of human functions up. That lends to a whole lot of issues. That lends to, number one, your ability to even fight, and number two, your ability for your immune system to even fight. Not to mention, like, when you're dealing with extreme external factors, like when they had that cold snap, that there haven't been any official numbers, but it certainly took a lot of Russians out of the fight because they didn't have proper cold weather gear.
No, you're absolutely right. And now you start thinking about, it's not just about having the procedures, but having the supply and logistics, right? There's a reason why, there's within the Army division structure, right? There's division commander, who's usually a 2-star general, and there's 2 deputy commanders. There's usually a 1-star who's a deputy commander for maneuver, which is combat, and there's a deputy commander for sustainment. There's an entire 1-star general with their own whole thing. Their focus is sustainment for division level, and their job is that, because they are co-equal, right? It doesn't, what's the joke? Bullets don't fly without supply, right? I've heard that one. It's really critical to consider all those things, and we don't have enough information about Russia's planning to know all of those details. But it's pretty clear to see from what we've been able to observe that they did too much. They expected to not need nearly as much sustainment as they did, and that has been a critical failure in their supplies, because they were expecting just waltzing through Ukraine in a few days. And if they waltzed through Ukraine in a few days, they brought more than enough, right? But now it's a months-long campaign, which is also brutally ironic, because that's literally how Russia has won every war of invasion into their territory, going back 6 centuries, is that everyone underestimated how much time it would actually take to get through Russia, and they died because of the supply and sustainment issue. And it's ironic that Russia didn't learn from its own victories.
Yeah, the whole never invade Russia in winter is now Russia and invasion in winter is a bad decision. Period. It doesn't matter if you're invading or being invaded.
And the whole argument, well, Ukraine's naturally part of Russia, is well, you're then invading part of Russia in winter. Good luck with that, folks.
Yeah, I guess if you're Russian and you think that Ukraine is Russian and say never invade Russia in winter, you royally fucked up your own calculus.
Absolutely.
On that one. Yeah. It's your slogan.
Absolutely.
So
No, it's been interesting to watch for sure, though. But I think there's definitely lessons learned, and there's plenty of pogues that I know in the military side who are like, that's why I have a job, right? That's great.
right. So no, that definitely makes things interesting to see, and especially because like it definitely like, and you can probably speak better to this than I can, but like that, you know, and when you have plenty of food, your morale is always a lot higher. It's when you start, with that first basic need, the lack of food, your morale is going to tank really quickly. And I mean, you saw that after a week that, when Russian soldiers would get captured, there were just video after video after video of them just stuffing their faces. So it's like, even for after just a week, it was like, holy cow, did they not plan for more than 2 days? Like, that's a pretty significant gap in at least having available food sources.
And it makes you wonder at what level of preparedness or what level of hierarchy did that fallout happen. And you have to think, right, just again, and I'm not an expert in military command and everything by any stretch. I do know my fair share, but I'm not a global expert by any stretch. But you have to imagine that it's probably at a very high level that these mistakes were happening, because it's a systemic issue. It's not that one or two brigades or one division of Russian fighters went down or stopped fighting because of sustainment issues. It's that literally, like, their entire major offensive along their northern front ground to a halt, and now they're to the point where they're now trying to rebrand themselves as like they're doing an eastern front only, and they abandon their assault on the Ukrainian capital. Like, that level of redirection because of major issues can only happen at very high command levels. And you go back to, like, Vietnam and Second World War, and even the First World War, like, when those major campaigns failed, it was because of decisions at the top that were then trickled down, as opposed to lots of simultaneously bad decisions happening at the bottom coming up. And again, we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that. We don't have the definitive proof. We don't have, Putin's emails. Her emails, lock him up, right? But
we predicted
sounds
that.
Like he's locking himself up.
We predicted that 2 weeks ago, that he would rebrand it and just go for that east. And I think about, in America, we call what you're talking about the blob. And we talked about that in Afghanistan, and how it collapsed so fast in Afghanistan was the fact that we removed the blob before our forces. And Russia has a real poor blob, I guess. Their infrastructure, their supply chains, just they weren't very quality. And now they're stealing food that's supposed to go into these towns. They're stealing it for themselves. So yeah, there's a desperation in the Russian army, but they still have the 10-1 odds,
I know it's really interesting to see. I'm gonna sit and try, and again, it feels kind of crass to think about this and not think about the empathy for the Ukrainian people, but like, they are going through some real rough stuff right now, and it, like you said, it's even rougher because not only, like, not that it wouldn't be rough if the Russians did their job properly and were able to completely destroy Ukraine, right? That would be terrible, but the reason for their suffering in this particular case is because in many cases the Russians were not properly prepared, and now they're going through and thinking, oh crap, we actually needed a lot more support in order to properly occupy and hold the city. Like, now we're going to start murdering people, right? There's all kinds of things that happen as downstream effects of when you don't properly plan things out. And that's the reason why we were able to become a global superpower after the Second World War, is because we just devoted our entire economy to winning the war. And we had all the supplies, we all had all the logistics, we were able to prepare, we timed things properly. And one could even say in certain campaigns we're too cautious and too well prepared in order to be effective. But then, if you especially look at the Pacific campaign, look at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, these campaigns that took weeks when they were expecting to take days, because they had proper supply chains, they were able to continue the offensive, right? And the decision to drop the atomic bomb was all based mainly on supply chain and casualty rates. Right, we were not going to be able to sustain a land invasion of Japan by manpower or supply for months, if not years, at the end of the Second World War. So that was what ultimately tipped their decision. So it's really critical for us to acknowledge and accept that, and but also to be empathetic to its actual impact on the ground, on the people who are just trying to live their lives, just trying to farm their wheat, and just trying to be 21st century ladies and gentlemen and everyone else, right? Just wanting to vibe, and and another country's like, no, we're going to ignore all of human history and dominate you because you belong to us because you never did, but we don't care. It's been really interesting to see that dynamic.
It's even harder
Right.
to have empathy for the Russian soldier that doesn't want to be there because they didn't know this was what they were going to do. There's some really bad Russian soldiers out there, like indiscriminately bombing civilians, but there's a lot of good people that didn't intend on this, that are just trying to get out of it, you know? And that's a shitty thing to have to deal with at the same time, giving empathy to your attacker, you know? But these are 18-year-olds. These are young people killing babies. And somebody's having them do that. We got to remember that. It's not the soldiers as much following, they're just following orders, and I don't know.
It's like also I mean, there's the war crimes issue, but also like most of their armies following orders to go in there, and like you know, the Russian casualties are definitely really high, but you're absolutely right, there's a lot of conscripts who are just coming in and just not even seeing combat. They're just being flung into the rural parts of Ukraine without adequate supply and adequate understanding, and kids getting captured, 16 17-year-old kids getting captured and calling home. We see the videos of them being like, we didn't know where we were going, we were just told to do this direction, and we found ourselves in Ukraine. Now I'm captured and I'm lost and I want to come home. It's like,
yeah,
you have to have empathy, because you think, you know, I wouldn't want to be in that position.
Right.
And you know, it kind of it makes me reflect on the JFK quote from back at the height of one of the heights of the Cold War, where he's like talking about the Iron Curtain, and it's to paraphrase, like, say what you want about capitalism and our culture, and it is not without sin and it is not without flaw by any stretch, but we've never had to build a wall to keep our people in.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the same idea as like the Americans, even throughout the original Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns, which were, you know, controversial from the beginning, but even during the surge, we never had a shortage of people who are willing to sign up, because at the very minimum they trusted that certain things were going to go right. Did they go right all the time? Absolutely not. Were the reasons for us being in those locations justified? That's a big conversation for another day, right? But at the end of the day, we did not have to forcibly conscript hundreds of thousands of underage men just to fill the ranks, to fulfill these certain desires. We had a sufficient standing army to fulfill the goals of the country. And it's kind of a testament to our ability to do that in our society, as opposed to what Russia's been trying to do.
Do you ever think that the legacy of the Middle East would be soldiers suffering from the effects of burn pits?
Oh yeah. Again, I know a thing or two about that, and it's the number one challenges that we're facing right now are the long-term effects of, you know, not just the PTSD and the suicide and the mental health of the trauma and everything, but we got really good at the fighting, but there are definitely shortcomings that we've had to deal with on the long term. We have a trouble of, like, we have our trouble in our society is that we can't do the long term finishing stuff really well, and that's why I'm a little concerned about with going back to COVID. You know, how are we going to, like, make sure that COVID doesn't happen again to the best of our ability? How are we going to make sure that these things continue to carry forward, right? We're very good at we're very effective at mobilizing for an immediate crisis, but how do we do it year 15, year 20? Right? That'll be interesting to see. And yeah, that's what we're facing with the burn pits and everything in Afghanistan. I think the major legacy is going to be, while we were dumping a lot of money into the Middle East for stability, China was dumping up that just as much money, if not more so, into developing sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia.
That's right. And
now that's going to face the new socio-political dynamic of the next 60, 70 years. Is going to be, how are we going to navigate this co-superpower relationship with China, because they are really on par with us, in some cases superior than us, in terms of their breadth and their strength and their abilities. So how do we navigate that while also navigating systemic issues like climate change, emerging infectious diseases, healthcare access? It's going to be very interesting to see, and I hope that you guys will do another 750 episodes to cover that time.
Yeah.
It'd be fun.
I got to worry about space. Russia and China are combining their efforts to create a space station. We're going to be locked out of space soon, you know?
Space Force.
Space Force. So this is the awkward time when I ask you guys for a just the tip, something to better somebody's life. And I'm gonna let Jeffrey start so that Dan can have a running start at his. You have any just the tips, Jeffrey?
Ooh, just the tip. Let's see. When playing Metro Exodus, definitely make sure that you stock up on as much materials as possible to make ammo and clean your weapons. Because let's be real honest, Metro is a really fun game, and most people don't tend to think about like figuring out like how you're going to be able to sustain combat. And it's kind of funny because like as I've been playing Metro Exodus and looking at how things have gone in Ukraine, I'm like, man, this there's something about this that feels a little too like close
Real, right?
to what's happened. And so like, you know, resource management is really important in the game, and being making sure that you have the resources that you need to sustain the fight is really important in Metro Exodus, but just in general.
My just the tip is you win every argument you walk away from. How about you, Dan?
I'm going to stick with the video game theme a little bit. If you have a VR headset and you play games on that, make sure that you are hydrated before you start playing, because then first of all, it's not just like it could be tiring on your body, but also making sure that you stay hydrated helps with your balance and helps because, you know, after you play VR for 45 minutes or an hour and you take the headset off and your head is swimming, you're much less likely to be nauseous if you're well hydrated beforehand. So if you're going to go do fun things that completely surround your sense of sight and hearing and everything with a wonderful VR headset, make sure you're taking care of yourself.
I love you guys.
I love you guys. Take care, guys. Have fun.
To those who would tear the world down, we will defeat you. This is our moment. This is our time. To those who seek peace and security, we support you. Yes, we can. And to all those who have wondered if America's beacon still burns as bright, tonight we prove once more that the true strength of our nation comes not from the might of our arms or the scale of our wealth, but from the enduring power of our ideals, democracy, liberty, opportunity, and unyielding hope.
Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbow. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You're nobody. It's gonna hit as hard as life.
Ask not.
Yes, we can.
What your country can do for you.
I have a dream.
Ask what you can do for your country.
My poor little children. Yes, we can.
One day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression.
In this lifetime, you don't have to prove nothing to nobody except yourself.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
That's how winning is done.
Welcome to Public Access America.
Yes, we can.
Sunday live streams on YouTube,
I wanted to run out of that tunnel for my dad.
on Twitter,
What?
Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Smart Radio Public, and Spotify.
Yes, we can.
Public Access America. History in the making, making history in the making.
With classes in crisis communication, influence, and data presentation, Gonzaga University's online Masters in Communication and Leadership equips you with the tools you need to communicate clearly and encourage creativity in any industry. Concentrations in digital media, strategic communication, and global leadership allow you to customize your degree. Visit gonzaga.edu/communication and learn why a master's degree from Gonzaga can help you take your career to the next level. That's gonzaga.edu/communication.
At Kroger, fresh groceries are our thing, so we check your delivery order for freshness at every step from farm to store and pick and pack every veggie in your free pickup order with care, because we treat your food the way we'd want ours to be treated. We're fresh every day, so shop anyway. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Free pickup on orders of $35 or more. Restrictions may apply.
And right now, you can save when you shop your faves. Just buy 6 or more participating sale items and save 50 cents each with your card. Kroger, fresh for everyone.